Welcome everyone to another edition of Moya Talks. We have Tamarah Begay today with us. Tamarah is the founder of IDS plus A, a Navajo woman-owned architectural firm. She is a member of the Navajo Nation and has over 10 years of experience working with Native American tribes on public safety, judicial, education, housing projects. She's an expert in master planning and site studies, and a lead specialist. Tamarah, welcome.
Welcome.
So we're honored to have you, and we always start these interviews by learning a little bit of our guest background. Why architecture? Where does your passion for design come from?
Well, yeah, I can introduce myself. Thank you guys for having us, and I'll introduce you in my native language. Yate Tamarah Begay Yinshe Nai Kaidina Enshe Kia Ani Bashachin Ashideshinali Tohoglini Deshache. So I introduced myself in my own native language. That's how we introduce ourselves and welcome each other. My Navajo culture, also Dene, we introduce ourselves, and we are a matrilineal society. So we take our mother's clan. So in my introduction, I introduced that I am from the Mexican people clan, and that's my mother's side. And I'm born for my father's side, which is the Towering House. So that's the two major clans that I relate to. So when I introduce myself, we relate to ourselves through clan relationships. So I have brothers or sisters or aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas that have the same clan that I have. That's how we relate to each other. That's how we introduce ourselves. And if anybody's out there that is Navajo, welcome.
Thank you, Tamarah. Tamarah, why architecture? How did you get to architecture?
Why architecture? Wow. I think at an early age, I was kind of drawn to architecture. I remember my parents and my grandmothers talk to me about how I would go outside and have my little animals, and I would just plan homes for them. So I think that kind of just gravitated, kind of like in a way like master planning. Excuse me. Master planning, and then my parents would say I would be up, I would go to sleep, they'd put me to sleep, and I would wake up and I would be building like homes out of like, shoe boxes. And I was like, yeah, that's really strange. I said, yeah, like you just would stay up. You would go to sleep and wake up. And I was like, yeah, preparing for architecture school, right? Like all-nighters. That's so when I was in elementary school, you have different people come and present the different professions. And I remember an individual, he was male, dark, dressed in a dark suit, light shirt, tie, and he had a roll of drawings in a tube. I always remember that. And then he had a model, and he was the last to present. And, you had your policemen, your doctors, your nurses, your firemen, and he put his model. And I just remember just being, very interested in the in the model. So I was introduced to architecture at an early age. That's why I think, introducing architecture, in kind of in the pipeline early educational phase to introduce people about what is an architect and what they do is important, to kind of really grow our profession. So I remember him explaining what an architect did and what architecture was. And at that moment, I was like, this is what I want to do. So I basically told my father, yeah, I want to be an architect. But I remember he did tell me, no, I don't want you to be an architect. But everything that I wanted to do, he always said no to as well. I wanted to be a football player, and he was like, no, you can't be a football player. So I was like, why, you're at a young age, and I feel like, you have kids and they tell you, oh, I want to be a scientist, I want to be, and you would encourage them, yeah, give them things to do and give them things to explore. And I felt like, no, I couldn't be a football player. No, I can't be an architect. So I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do with myself? And I think his expectation was to go back, get my education, go back to my community and help my community and get a degree in sociology. So I did do that. I went to school and I was taking a lot of sociology classes, but I wasn't really passionate about it. And I always see myself running over to the architecture school and looking at the models and looking at the drawings. And I'm like, this is what really I wanted to do. But all that whole entire time, I felt like still I was kind of like introduced to architecture, like I helped my dad draft his house. I helped my dad actually physically build his home. I remember, using, the CMU block for the foundation, making sure you had the string to making sure it was plumb, right, straight. So, so I think a lot of those, again, were kind of inspirations to get into architecture. But in my profession, I finally realized that, architecture, in my communities, in, Indigenous communities and around Navajo, they were really, the architecture there was brought by the government, like all the schools, all the housing, and it didn't really represent who we were. And I felt like, the government gave us these homes and that's what we had to live in, or this is what we had to go to school for, and this is like the healthcare we had to, go to. So I feel like there was a lot of changes, and I in school, in architecture school, I had a lot of inspiration from where I came from and like the history and my culture. So I tried to add that in school, but I felt like in that path, a lot of the instructors were like, you're making this stuff up, right? Like, but I feel like they didn't understand Indigenous architecture. They didn't understand the idea of the connection to the land. Like, we were here, like, the whole story about, Columbus discovering America, I'm like, hey, the Indigenous people were on this land. So, talking about, those ideas of land, history, and culture, and bringing that into some of my projects and my concepts, the instructors, I felt, were a little like put off by it, like I would make this stuff up. So I struggled a lot in architecture school, not until I, got into my profession and I was able to talk about it and kind of articulate things about the importance of Indigenous architecture. People were more in tune to, the idea of adding that into architecture, but not so much when I would work for other architecture firms too. I feel like that connection wasn't really there yet. So I was like, this is something I want to do. And, I want to definitely make a different path. And how do you do that, right? So at IDSA, and what we've come up with, is just this way of indigenously, taking those ideas of this worldview and taking those ideas of how you used to design and plan, historically, these communities, going back to the original way that we would design and plan and think, and collaborate with people. So it's a different process in a way. And I think it's a process that needs to be looked at, and it doesn't have to be just be used in Indigenous communities. It could be used in, urban settings and non-Indigenous projects, because this land is very sacred. And, we just need to kind of touch and go back to the way that we used to design and plan and think.
Is this why you specialize in master planning?
We do master planning, but we also do, when I was in architecture school, I think my emphasis was kind of on planning. But once I understood that maybe going into architecture would be more, you'd have more opportunities in terms of like architecture, the built environment. So my background, I do have a more education in terms of like planning, but I graduated with an architecture background. So this idea of, Indigenous planning and design goes back to my planning side, but then here at IDSA, we also do architecture buildings. Today we have 2 staff members going to the final walkthrough of a Head Start building, which should have been opened about 6 months ago, but with the whole pandemic, there's a lot of, waiting for HVAC equipment, some of the doors, some of the security. So finally it's there, and we'll be opening up the new building in probably a couple of weeks for the community.
Is this a Standing Rock Hester Center?
Yeah, it's on the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo name is Se'ia. It's a Standing Rock Head Start facility. So the Head Start facility was designed to think about, the Navajo culture, kind of an immersion program. Like when you go into the building, everything is going to be taught, spoken, learned in terms of Navajo. So the architecture is really reflective of that approach to, their Head Start learning approach.
What was inspiration, the vision behind this project?
The inspiration really was about the land. So that connection to the land and the ownership. And typically the way that we start a project is really having that connection to land. So people could say it's a site analysis, but it's really not a site analysis, but it's kind of walking around and really understanding the elements of the site. So just the way that, the sun hits the site, the way that you feel the breezes on the site, the way that you see the views, the way that you see all of the animals, the birds, the insects, because Indigenous people really kind of understanding, all of, again, there's the insects, the animals, the birds, and really understanding that. So our architecture really is that inspiration of the land before we get into anything, about the walls or the roof. So based off of that, we meet with the community members, talking about kind of the vision for their facility. And this is a real community to that connection to the land. We also talk to the community members, and that's how we come up with our concepts. So our concepts is basically the vision and the stories that we hear from the community. So we listen first, and that's one of the inspirations. And you think about Indigenous worldview, it's about listening first. And then out of those stories, we come up with our concepts and parties. So that specific design really stemmed from, the land, which it should, as well as the community's voices and their stories, and how that design kind of unfolds.
Do you find a balance between development, tradition, and the stakeholders in the community, in the Navajo community?
Yeah, that's a good question. The balance that we try to do is really about having some type of, you get comments from everywhere, right? Like that's the big thing. But the thing on Navajo is that Navajo does also not have codes. So there's no codes that have been adopted on Navajo. So in a way, we do struggle with, again, these ideas of, traditional architecture prototypes. And if they get funds from federal government, they have to abide by, again, like some of the codes. So the codes will not, so there is a difference between that. So we have to look at how we can include some of the traditional ideas with kind of modern technology. And we do that really well. And you have to really understand, again, the importance of, Indigenous architecture. It's not literally taking, the prototypical Indigenous architecture that you see, and you see this a lot. And if you're not familiar with Indigenous architecture, where their schools are being built that are shaped like a turtle, right? Or schools that are built like a shape like a teepee or a hogan. So when people design those, they don't really understand really the essence of, the Indigenous architecture. And the way that we do it and the way that I teach it is also about coming up with these design principles, because there's a lot of meaning behind the architecture itself. Like the reason why you have a door opening to the east, why you enter clockwise into a building, and why are the cardinal directions important, and what are the meaning behind those cardinal directions. So um, I like to educate people about that, because it's just not the architecture itself. Like you see an igloo, a teepee, or a hogan. um, those are different, right? So it's really understanding the meaning behind all the reason why there's a meaning why it's built there. Every meaning in terms of indigenous architecture, a column is put there, and there's a significant meaning for that. The why you situate the doors, there's a meaning behind that. So there's a really good balance to understand that, and to bring in also this modern idea of modern materials, contemporary language into the architecture.
Yeah, it's not about mimicking, but
Nope.
actually creating with consciousness, right?
Yep.
Right. So you mentioned something interesting when you talk about the code. Do you think this can be codified to make it easier to get funding? Like if you have to abide by the code, could the Navajo community contribute to creating that code?
I think the Navajos can create a code that can really embrace some of these, indigenous architecture. And of course, as architects, you have to really look at really the health, safety, and welfare. And I feel sometimes like some of these codes also restrict us to do a lot of different things. But if you were thinking about it and we're designing, we're building, we're thinking about, our health, safety, and welfare issues and the occupants in it, there's ways that I think we can, as designers and architects, really work, kind of uniformly together to come up with something that is really compatible in using a lot of these indigenous, architecture materials.
You mentioned that your father wanted you to study sociology. So to circle back to that, how do you see architectures as cultural mediators, as agents of change in the Navajo community?
Yeah, my taking sociology, and I talk about this idea of the social well-being wheel, right? And people will look at it, and I said, well, if you think about indigenous architecture, you think about this idea of the social well-being wheel, and you think about architecture, it's really about, that idea that the building can also heal. It can also, bring, for instance, when I was growing up, I feel like as a Navajo woman, we were stripped again, from our land. We were told not to, speak our language. We were told, the men would wear long hair, and the reason why they would have long hair is because it meant that, that was really their beauty, and also their strength, and their wisdom, right? To have long hair. And the Navajo people were put into boarding schools, and they cut their hair. They would cut their hair. But there was a meaning behind that. And all the things I feel like kind of the Western way of a life that was brought onto a lot of indigenous communities was ripping their language, ripping their culture, ripping their family unit. And this idea of the social well-being wheel is that it's kind of reinforcing people that, hey, it's okay to cry, right? I feel like all of us, in a way, this Western way that we were been taught, you better not cry, like you got to show your toughness in you. You got to show that, you're not the weak one. But if we've all been there where, we've had a lot of emotions and we have a lot of things going on, and to hold that in, it's like it's damaging our body, it's damaging our soul. But this idea of the social well-being wheel is reinforcing that it's okay to, be emotional. It's okay to cry, and you're going to feel better about that. And having that connection into architecture where we can design spaces interior and exterior, for the idea of that social well-being. And if we were to follow those indigenous ways, we wouldn't be in some of the issues that we have today that people are talking about, right? Like, in the pandemic, people were just coped up. So if you think about it, that's what Indigenous people, were pushed into. We were pushed into a home. We couldn't express ourselves. We couldn't express our culture or our language. And, we've had then, and you think about the Western way, then this idea of like alcoholism and drugs, it's like we have to be able to be spirited. We have to be able to honor ourselves, honor our Mother Earth and Father Sky. So I really think that learning from the Indigenous way and Indigenous architecture, there's a lot of like healing that needs to happen. People talk about climate change, and climate change, Mother Earth is shaking us up. It's telling us we got to listen. We got to listen to the earth. We got to listen to the beat of the earth. We got to listen to all of the human beings, two-legged, four-legged, going back to this way of being respectful to ourselves, respectful to who we are, respectful to each other. So that social well-being will really connects it. And architecture, as we know, is just not a building. Architecture can heal us. Architecture can be something else. It can teach us about our history, it can teach us about our culture, it can teach us about ourselves.
Excellent. That's a great analogy between the pandemic and...
Yeah.
So, Tamarah, I'm going to open the floor because I know the staff will have questions for you. So go ahead, people. It always takes a little bit.
Oh, I was going to raise my hand, but I'll just go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Tamarah. I live in Vancouver. And so, of course, here in Canada as well, there's a lot of history with Indigenous people and, most recently, all the atrocities at the residential schools. And so I guess my question was, it's really interesting to hear your perspective about just architects learning more from Indigenous people and the way things should be built or the way should be connected. So in your opinion, how do you think that architecture firms like Moya, for example, can support like our people, like our architects or like interior designers or, our project managers? How could we support them to learn more about Indigenous communities, to learn more from Indigenous communities, from people like yourself of, even as you said, like styles of architecture that maybe they didn't get to learn in school because that history has been rewritten in a certain way?
Yeah, I would say, for, your firm or other firms out there is, connect with other Indigenous people. And there's not many of us out there like as architects and designers. For instance, like Indigenous women, they're like less than 8 of us, that are licensed. But, if you can connect with them and understand their way, right? And learn about it. And a lot of the books and the textbooks, there's very limited, but it's all about, if you remember, I told you, it's all about listening. It's about listening to those stories. And we come up with planning principles, and design principles, and we work with different Indigenous communities, right? Here in the United States, there's over 574, recognized, tribal recognized tribes by the government. And that's a lot, right? And so, but the thing is that we all share that common view of this Indigenous worldview. It's that connection to Mother Earth and Father Sky, and understanding the listening, and then understanding the process, that the process is always not a straight line, and it takes time. And the thing is, it takes time. If you look at a lot of our Indigenous architecture that's still standing today, it took years to plan it. They took years to talk about it. So really studying up on it, and collaborating. And then, for me, I would be really happy to just have firms really embrace this idea of Indigenous, design thinking and planning, and having this speak about it at a larger scale. Like, hey, what can we do kind of in an urban setting, and learn about how can we incorporate this? So having that conversation, and I think your firm, having this conversation, it is like, again, it's putting the word out there, and putting the word about, how can we make this place better? How can we leave Mother Earth better? Right? Mm-hmm. We all live on it. We all share in it. We all walk on it. And if we can come to this consensus of, better building, better planning, and thinking about how we want to leave this planet when we leave, and thinking about, our generation, the generations, three generations before and 3 generations behind, like thinking about that, right? Like we don't really do that in a kind of like a Western way. And I think that, just connecting to people and continue to having these conversations are really important.
Thank you.
Great question, Nora. You have time for one more question?
I have one.
Please go ahead.
Tamarah, you mentioned something about architecture and planning healing people. How would you say that works?
It works, and I will give you an example. Architecture, especially Indigenous communities, and if you think about not just Indigenous communities, you build a building and there's a need for it, right? There's a need, and say it's a school, and you have to really understand all the social ills. You have to understand the community itself. And once you understand it, the school is needed specifically to provide a service, right? And in an Indigenous community, it's all about trying to either save their language or relearn their language culture. But within the architecture building itself, you can design things, that are not literal interpretations, but again, they're significant to where the community can go back and learn about the history of the people, or the history of the language, or the history of their culture and the people itself. And I feel like once they learn that, and they have this idea of, the balance and harmony and the beauty behind it, people start to be, they can be healed by it, right? They can say, this is who we are. Like, this is who we could be proud of who we are. And I feel like as human beings, we all come from a significant place. We all have our stories. We all have our families, right? And taking us back to where we come from and where we belong, brings a sense of like healing of where we're at. And I think if we can think of building and planning on that, it's not just about, making that buck of development. It's all about that getting healing people and bringing back to who they are and the purpose of why we're here.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Tamarah, thank you very much for your answers. Thank you very much for your time, despite the difficulties and despite what happened to your office. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah, thank you. And if anybody has questions, feel free to contact me. I would really enjoy to spread that word about, Indigenous design, and how you guys could incorporate that as part of your design process.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamarah. This was great.
This was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.